This is What the Jam. Today we've got Jim Fisk here, and we're going to be talking all things Jamstack. So welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Mike.
I want to start off. Let's cut straight to it. What
Yeah.
does Jamstack mean to you, Jim?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I think, I think about Jamstack in kind of the classical way that it was defined when I think Netlify was coining the term. They're kind of like bringing to the public consciousness this new way of building websites. And around that time, it was, I think, 2016, late 2016, early 2017, I started a Jamstack Boston meetup
Hmm.
because I was really interested in building websites that way. So I took it to mean kind of this paradigm where you build sites fully before deploying them, and then you deploy a built asset to whether it's a CDN or a server somewhere that is no longer rendering each page when a visitor comes to your website, but it's kind of pre-built those assets ahead of time. Um, I think there's a lot of confusion around the term. I think especially because the acronym JAM could mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. So
Hmm.
I think people who come from that perspective and have that context about the origin of the term or the beginnings of some of these meetups, they understand the term. And I think it's done a pretty good job of branding it as something that people do understand. But I think new people coming to it are a little confused because lots of websites use JavaScript APIs in markup.
Yes.
And a lot of those sites are not Jamstack by any means, even though they use the full acronym. So I think the term has a little bit of confusion maybe around it. And so I've toyed with some different ideas about terms that I like better. So I think I don't know. There's a few things in the industry that people like to use, right? So there's Jamstack. The problem I have with that is that a lot of applications use those acronyms. There's static site generation, which is kind of the same concept in my mind, at least in the old,
Hmm.
like the historical fashion. But static sites are kind of, they don't fully encompass what Jamstack sites can be, because the
Hmm.
idea of static makes it sound really simple. It makes it sound like it's just HTML. Can't really do much interactivity, but these things can actually be quite dynamic once they're deployed. So I feel like that doesn't fully encompass what the concept is to me either. And then you get all sorts of debates about client-side rendering, server-side rendering. Jamstack, I'm working on an application that actually does both. It just depends on when we do it. So I feel
Hmm.
like these conversations are also muddy. It's like, is it a server-side rendering framework? It's like, well, yes, at build time it is, but it's not once it's deployed. So um, for me, the best term that I've kind of come up with, and I don't really care much about the language, I just care more about what it communicates, is this
Yes.
idea of build time rendering versus on-demand rendering. And I feel like that cuts to the core of what the actual concept is. It's when do these processes take place? Um, my project does server-side rendering and then client-side rendering once you actually deploy the app, but I feel like that's irrelevant. So that's kind of my perspective on it. I don't know. Have you had similar conversations with folks?
Yeah, I think that clarity makes a lot of sense because there's no Jamstack. You always need to define, and then one of the major problems is everyone's definition is a little bit different.
Yeah.
But build time rendering, it would be hard to see how someone would have a different definition of what that it is. Very clear and cut what it is. So let's. When did you come into the Jamstack scene, and were you doing static or build time rendering before that, or
Hmm.
were you did this kind of open your eyes to that architecture?
Yeah, I was classically a CMS developer, so a lot of Drupal and WordPress development. But I've always kind of had a proclivity towards front end development and like CSS and some very simple JavaScript, not heavy, isomorphic JavaScript, but like very simple kind of interactivity on the front end. So for me, when I first kind of heard the concept, I didn't know the term yet. So I was introduced to Jekyll, which is a
Mm.
Ruby-based static site generator, probably 2015, somewhere around then. At first, I really didn't think of it as more than kind of like a prototyping, like toy project. Honestly, I
Mm.
was like, this is really cool to build things really quickly. But then when you need to actually deploy like a client site or something with requirements that are real world, then you have to then take your ideas that you built in something like Jekyll and then convert them to WordPress or Drupal or Ruby on Rails or whatever framework that can handle kind of the full
Yeah.
spectrum of needs. So I was introduced to the concept then. but I didn't take it too seriously. And then somewhere down the road, I started learning some more about different things that are out in the ecosystem that really kind of supercharged the power of the Jamstack. And then the term was kind of coming out and gaining some traction at the time. So I became like really fascinated with it, because to me, it allowed a front end developer like myself to have kind of superpowers, to not have to deal with a lot of the other kind of tricky parts of deploying an application. So, the idea was I could build a full experience and then kind of sprinkle in microservices to get kind of the full application experience. I don't know that it's fully played out that way entirely, but I think potentially the ecosystem is still young in its whole trajectory. So someday I think that might be a lot easier. But right now I think it's somewhat there, but there's a lot to be desired still, to be honest.
Yeah. No, agreed. What you mentioned a project that you're working on in this space. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess kind of stepping back, I started kind of doing my first production style Jamstack app with the city of Boston. So I worked on Boston.gov. They have a Drupal technology, but we had to build some subsites for the Office of Budget Management to display a lot of their fiscal information. And we had a tight turnaround. So we actually ended up using Jekyll and then a lot of custom stuff with it. So we like kind of pulled in a custom gulp pipeline, and there's a lot of things going on. It was very complicated, but we were building 1,600 pages on the Jamstack, and it really like sparked, my interest about how easy this stuff could be. I was already running the Jamstack Boston meetup at the time. So I was very excited about this technology. In doing that, I kind of, build times became really important. So Jekyll had some performance lags for large websites when you start getting into the thousands of pages. So something like Hugo became very interesting to me at the time. I was also playing around with Get Back CMS technology. So at the time I was using Netlify CMS, which is been rebranded to Decap, I believe.
Yeah,
and so I was playing around with that technology in the meetup, and I was really seeing the power of kind of building this full application experience with Get Back technology and fast build times. And so I was kind of really hoping at the time that someone would just more tightly integrate something like Hugo and Netlify CMS. And because there's a lot of friction points to that workflow. You don't really have good previews or any previews because Netlify CMS is built in React and Hugo uses Go templates on the front end. You often have to define your data source for your static site generator and then kind of recreate it in your Get Back CMS. So I was really hoping someone would tightly couple that. I didn't see a lot going on in terms of the way that I wanted to approach the problem. So eventually I created my own project called Plenti. It's a namespace under Plentico on GitHub. It's open source. It's free. There's no monetization on it besides donations, but it's our attempt to basically to merge those two experiences a little closer. And right now it's currently built on Svelte templates. So I don't know if you're familiar with Svelte at all, but it has a front-end experience where you can kind of scope styles and have some JavaScript interactivity built in. But you also get a CMS kind of out of the box that gets deployed with your site to a CDN. So that was our attempt at doing it. It's still a pretty small project in terms of like actual people using it, but it's something that I've been steadily working on for over 3 years now and don't really have plans to stop. So cool. That's kind of where I'm spending my time in the Jamstack at this point.
Very cool. Yeah, I think we need a lot more activity in that space for sure. And a Git-based CMS leans much more into that pre-rendering like mindset and kind of architectural decision. So what over the past, I mean, Jamstack's been a term for maybe 8 years now. As the organizer of a meetup, how have you seen it evolve over those years?
Yeah, this is a hard question for me to answer. So, because the pandemic, I think, made things a little strange. So we were getting pretty large in-person meetups in Boston, and granted, Boston's a good place to do that because there's a pretty good tech scene and people are, there's some incubators in there, and we were actually getting a lot of new folks. So we would have, maybe 70 or 80 people reply to our meetup saying they're coming, but only half would show up. So we get somewhere between 35 to 45 people
nice.
At a meetup, which we were happy about. And a lot of the folks coming were new. I don't know if they really knew what Jamstack was, but they were interested in technology. They were looking for jobs. They're coming out of the incubators and stuff like that. So we had a lot of those folks. And then we had some veterans who would come every time who had experience in the space, but they were, a smaller percentage, I think, of the people coming up. So I think the the term was really thriving. I think it was getting like people were starting meetups all over the place. There was a really natural pull to get people in the meetup. I think our meetup, I can't remember the exact numbers. We're not super active at the moment, but we're close to maybe 2,000 members at one point. And so like it really like grew pretty organically without a ton of marketing effort on our part, which was really cool. So I think the term was taken off on its own, and some of that might have been meetup.com's promotion. I'm not sure. So it was really thriving. Since it seems like, especially during the pandemic, numbers went down a fair amount, but I think that was just kind of natural across the board. I think people had meetup fatigue by sitting on Zoom calls all day. So that was part of it. And then it seems like a lot of some of these Jamstack style meetups that I used to kind of talk with some of the organizers, I've been seeing kind of through the grapevine, and even meetups sent me emails to take over some of these groups because I think they're kind of defunct. We're not super active with our group. So I don't know if that's just, people getting tired of running meetups through pandemic, or if Jamstack is kind of losing steam as a term. I don't know. I'm not sure if you've experienced any of that, or if you have thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of debate in the community about what Jamstack even is. And then I think it's very hard to form a community around an idea when it can't be agreed on what it is. And then it's not used as a term because no one can agree on it. I think all of these things kind of contribute to it being less and less relevant. And that's what we're really interested in having these conversations, is to get all these ideas out there and talk about them and try and figure out how we can solve them and have a tighter definition and a tighter community around these ideas. Because I think the principles of Jamstack are really good, but they kind of get lost in all this grayness.
Yeah. And I think there's challenges too. I still am a believer of Jamstack after all this time. And we're building a couple of large production apps right now, actually using Plentico, the framework I discussed. And when you push it to the enterprise level with lots of complex requirements like, database backends and authentication and payments, we're doing all that stuff on these apps. Jamstack, the ease and the benefit of, so I think that front end experience being super easy for small websites is like a huge benefit. And then when you push it to that degree, and I think a lot of folks end up hitting this problem where you start being like, I'm not sure that this is less complicated than a monolith at this point, right? And so I think some of those problems could be solved with better microservices that handle these things with less effort. But right now it's really challenging to kind of string those things together. And I feel like you have to really have some pretty in-depth experience to put it together in a cohesive way that gives you a full application experience. And so I think some people have kind of hit up against that on the upper end where they're pushing these things to farther and farther places. And I think it's caused some discontent in the community where I've seen people go so as far as they think like the idea of Jamstack is a lie because it can't solve those problems. But I think it can. I think those things just get more challenging as it gets, larger in scope. So I've seen a couple of projects like Astro, for instance. I think Astro started as a Jamstack first framework. And then they kind of realized through either community feedback or dog fooding or whatever, but they decided that they need to have both kind of avenues. They still have this pre-rendering aspect to it, but they also have this idea of on-demand rendering too. I think we're even kind of finding that in our project where I think Jamstack is the heart of what we do and we want to continue that, but there might be a need for a different experience for other types of applications. I don't know. It doesn't solve every problem in every case.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's something we should talk about as a community. Is like, Jamstack's not a silver bullet. It's great for some use cases. But if you're really having to work around and put spinners on the screen because you're trying to do everything Jamstack, it's like, well, server-side rendering is a great architecture for certain sort of problems, and build time rendering is a great architecture for a certain set of problems. There's an area between where it might make it's less obvious which way to go, but I think having that tighter definition in the community around build time rendering allows us to actually have that conversation and not be like, how do we solve these really complex problems with like a purely build time rendered approach, because it may not make sense, and that's fine.
Yeah, and I think people also like they go the other extreme where they claim that you can't accomplish those things in a build time render approach, and you really can. So
Yeah.
you can stitch together microservices to do certain things. We're using Pocket Base as a database backend on a couple apps, and it's you can like certainly do full application stuff in a Jamstack architecture.
Yes.
I mean, we are and we're also getting really optimized builds and fast front end. So yeah, I think there's nuance to the conversation, of course. I also think that there's some really interesting projects that I would love somebody to breathe more life into, or kind of like or reinvent it at some point. Like for one that comes to mind is like Go Commerce was another Netlify open source project. It was really cool. So the idea there is basically you could run this microservice or have someone else run it for you. That you could build a shopping cart in your front end that you could check out on using Go Commerce, and then instead of like having a tight integration there, Go Commerce would essentially crawl your website to make sure the pricing and the metadata there actually matches what the checkout experience is. And I feel like something like that is a really awesome idea that just, I don't know, it really got carried through. I think they decided to change priorities because they didn't want to compete in the commerce space, which is pretty competitive. So I don't know. I'd love to see more development in that.
I agree. I think if you can pre-build something, you're going to have a whole lot of benefits. Like it's
Sure.
It's going to be faster, more scalable, more secure. All these things we talk about. Yeah. And now in a world of where there's this spectrum of from pre-built to kind of serverless to getting into dynamic of what Jamstack is.
Yeah.
Those constraints, people don't really think of those constraints anymore of let's try and pre-build as much as we can, and then if we can't, let's move to one of the other options. I just think there is so much innovation that we can do in the space of pre-building that a lot of the limitations that we think about can be resolved.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's undersold the benefit of the simplicity of an architecture that has an atomic deployment process. So the idea that you build and your full site is there, obviously there's so much in between. Like you said, there's serverless, there's incremental builds, there's all these things that add complexity to either increase speed or performance or this or that. But having the simple, like old school Jamstack way of, I'm going to build the site, and then this could be this ephemeral thing that could live over here. I could tear it down there. I could deploy it over here. The idea of that, it's more challenging from the project creator, the static site generator creator, to make that fast and consistent, et cetera. Yes. But if you can do it in a fully atomic way, it's super powerful. And I think people don't necessarily give that enough credit for how great that is. You could set up your own deployment and hosting pipeline if you wanted to do that. And it wouldn't even be that hard because atomic builds just make it static files on a server.
I think that's kind of the key idea, is that portability as well, where I'm going to end up with a bunch of HTML files that I can basically deploy to any server.
Yep.
And the more, and that's really that idea of decoupling as well, is I'm not locked into any platform doing that. But as soon as you start doing more dynamic-y things and you're bringing in that business logic, now you don't have that anymore. You're tied to a platform, and you lose some of the big benefits of Jamstack.
Yeah, I've certainly been hearing lots of debates. I won't name certain companies, but there's lots of people who are finding themselves locked into certain technology and certain platforms that work well with those technology, because the deployment and hosting architecture is so complex that it's really hard to kind of move off it. So I think, I don't know, there's something about transparency to builds that is pretty nice. Also, like you said, you could do so much with those simple builds. You could have different deployments for different branches or different rules in CI that build these things to different places and interact in different ways. So it's pretty, it's pretty powerful if you're interested in that kind of stuff.
Agreed. Jim, what do you think for Jamstack, or the idea of Jamstack to remain relevant to the web development community? What do you think needs to be done in the term and the future of Jamstack? What do you think needs to change for Jamstack to thrive?
Yeah, that's an a difficult question. I mean, obviously, I'm like you in the sense that I would love clarity around the term, and I love the conversation to shift to something that that describes actually what's being done instead of a branding term. But again, I think those sometimes those things are harder than you think they are. Like I'm sure it was not easy to make Jamstack a sticky thing to begin with, right? There's some
Yes.
marketing effort that goes into that, and there's things that I don't really fully understand into making that a thing. So and I don't know. I mean, like I'm not sure that's the hill I want to die on to be like we have to change it, but I'm all about it. I'm all about adding clarity to the term. I think build time rendering is better. If people think that that term is too complex, I think there's a little bit of complexity in those words. So if that's not clear to folks, and I think something that describes it in simpler language, I'm okay with. But yeah, I think that would be something I would love to see. But at the end of the day, if people can understand the concept, and we're just gonna, if the momentum is more behind Jamstack, I mean, so be it. As far as I'm concerned, for me, I think the real thing that holds the community back and the adoption back is more services around it. I think there needs to be, um, more, especially open source tools around microservices to let you build certain experiences, whether it's commerce or form backends or authentication or databases or whatever it is. The more seamless we can make that experience and make it seem like you're not doing huge trade-offs by trading in your monolith for a build time rendering architecture, I think that would really explode the experience. And especially, and I'm not against people having hosted platforms for those things too. I think if you can make somebody's life easy to ease into that architecture, then great. Yeah, for me, I think the ecosystem's still a little immature, honestly, even though it's been around for a while, and things have, I don't want to discredit. I mean, there's tons of people building awesome things in the space. I don't know. I just like to see more of that, I guess.
Yeah, me too. Jim, thank you so much for joining today. This is a great chat.
Yeah, of course. All right. Thank you, Mike.